Some sadness doesn't arrive with a story, which is what makes it feel so unsettling. You wake up tired, answer texts normally, and still feel like something inside you dimmed. Nothing dramatic happened, yet your chest feels heavier than the day actually deserves. And that almost makes it worse, because pain without a reason feels impossible to trust. You start scanning your life like a detective, looking for evidence that explains the feeling. Maybe it's stress, maybe hormones, maybe burnout, maybe you're just being ungrateful again. So you keep moving, hoping the feeling will leave if you stay useful enough. But hidden grief does not disappear just because your calendar stays full. It waits in quiet places, especially when your mind finally stops performing strength. And then it hits you in strangely ordinary moments that should mean absolutely nothing. While folding laundry, while driving home after a completely normal conversation, while standing in the grocery store under fluorescent lights, staring at a shelf too long. You don't break down exactly, but something inside you softens and sinks. Not enough to call it a crisis, just enough to remind you that something unresolved is still living there. This is the science of hidden grief that rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It often feels less like sobbing and more like emotional weather you cannot predict. A grayness that moves through you without asking permission or leaving clear fingerprints. Because grief is not only about death, funerals, or obvious endings people can point to. Sometimes grief comes from what never happened, never healed, or never got named. The childhood comfort you needed but learned not to ask for. The version of you that adapted too early. The friendships that slowly changed while both of you pretended nothing was wrong. The relationship that ended long before the official goodbye ever came. The years you spent being strong in ways nobody should have needed. The energy you lost becoming someone acceptable enough to stay loved. That kind of grief hides well because it was built around survival. And survival teaches you to function before it teaches you to feel. So instead of falling apart, you become reliable. You answer emails. You show up on time. You make jokes at dinner. You remember birthdays and send thoughtful messages and keep everyone else emotionally comfortable. Meanwhile, some part of you is carrying a sadness too old to explain quickly. That is why hidden grief confuses so many thoughtful people. It doesn't always announce itself as loss. Sometimes it shows up as irritability toward people you actually care about. Sometimes it feels like numbness during moments that should feel meaningful. Sometimes it becomes exhaustion that sleep does absolutely nothing to fix. Sometimes it looks like jealousy that surprises you because it feels embarrassingly out of character. Sometimes it sounds like a quiet thought saying, "I don't know what's wrong with me." But hidden grief is rarely about something being wrong with you. It is usually about something real happening inside you without enough language around it. Your mind wants a clean explanation because clean explanations feel emotionally manageable. But grief is messy, especially when it formed during periods where honesty felt unsafe. If you grew up in a house where feelings complicated everything, you learned efficiency, not emotional truth. You learned how to read moods before speaking. You learned how to keep the peace without making your own needs visible. You learned that being easy to handle was safer than being fully known. And those skills can make you look mature long before you actually feel free. People may even praise you for how calm and self-aware you seem. But calm is not always peace. Sometimes calm is what a nervous system looks like after practicing self-erasure for years. That matters, because hidden grief often lives in adaptation, not in obvious breakdowns. And the smile that appears exactly when disappointment should have had room to breathe. In the way you say, "It's fine," before your body has agreed. In how quickly you minimize what hurt you because other people had it worse. In the weird guilt you feel anytime your pain lacks a dramatic headline. So you keep disqualifying your own sadness before it can become real enough to understand. That creates a painful split. Part of you feels wounded. Another part cross-examines the wound until it goes quiet again. This is why some people feel sad for years without knowing why. Not because the reason is absent. Because the reason was buried under usefulness, comparison, distraction, and emotional self-editing. And buried feelings do not die. They change form. They leak into your energy. They shape your reactions. They make small disappointments feel strangely ancient. They turn simple rejection into something much heavier than the moment itself. That heavy feeling is usually not just about right now. It is also about every earlier moment your sadness had nowhere safe to land. Think about how grief behaves in the body. Before the mind creates words, the body creates signals. A tighter jaw, a hollow stomach, a sudden drop in motivation, the urge to cancel plans you were excited about yesterday, the strange tiredness that appears after being around people who weren't even unkind, the ache behind your eyes when someone asks if you're okay too gently. These reactions are not random glitches. They are often stored emotional meanings surfacing through sensation before conscious understanding catches up. Your body remembers what your personality learned to work around. That is why hidden grief can make ordinary life feel quietly expensive. Simple things require too much inner effort. Small choices feel heavy. Noise feels louder. Messages feel harder to answer. Even joy can feel complicated because pleasure sometimes brushes against old deprivation. You may notice this most after good moments, after a birthday dinner, after a successful project, after laughter with friends. You get home, sit in the silence, and feel unexpectedly low. Not because the moment was fake, because goodness can expose how starved certain parts of you have been. That contrast can hurt. Sometimes hidden grief also shows up as being deeply moved by things other people overlook. A child waiting alone outside school. An old voicemail you accidentally replayed. A stranger sounding disappointed without trying to hide it. A song you have heard 100 times, suddenly feeling unbearable. You tell yourself you are being too sensitive again. But sensitivity is often where unprocessed truth first becomes visible. People who feel deeply are not imagining more pain. They are often noticing pain that others learn to step around faster. And when you have spent years being emotionally observant, sadness can become almost atmospheric. You feel the room. You feel the pause in someone's voice. You feel your own loneliness before you can intellectualize it into something respectable. That awareness can be beautiful. It can also be exhausting when you have never been taught what to do with it. So instead of grieving directly, you start translating grief into productivity, overthinking, or withdrawal. You call it needing space. You call it a low-energy week. You call it one of those moods. And sometimes that language is fine. But sometimes it keeps you far away from the real ache underneath. Because naming hidden grief can change everything. Not instantly. Not dramatically. But honestly. The moment you stop asking, why am I sad, for no reason, something shifts. Because maybe there is a reason. Maybe it just doesn't fit the kind of loss people usually validate. Maybe nobody taught you that disappointment can accumulate into grief. Maybe chronic misunderstanding can become grief. Maybe growing up unseen can become grief. Maybe giving the strong one too early can become grief. Maybe never feeling chosen without performing can become grief. And maybe your sadness has been trying to say that for years. There is a reason this feeling often gets stronger during quieter seasons. When life slows down, what was postponed starts knocking louder. Grief loves unscheduled space. Not because it wants to ruin peace. Because peace finally gives it enough silence to be heard. That is why vacations can make some people unexpectedly emotional. That is why weekends can feel heavier than workdays. That is why late nights become confession booths your daylight self avoids. When the distractions thin out, the deeper material rises. Not to punish you. To be integrated. And hidden grief does not always ask for a dramatic release. Sometimes it asks for a more honest sentence. I miss who I could have been there. I am still hurt by how alone I felt. I never got to be small when I needed to be. I keep acting okay because I do not trust what happens otherwise. Those sentences can feel simple. They are not. They break years of emotional camouflage. Real life offers clues everywhere once you begin looking differently. The coworker who seems fine but feels empty after every meeting might be grieving invisibility. The friend who disappears after social plans may be grieving how performative connection can feel. The partner who overreacts to small distance may be grieving much older abandonment. The adult child who dreads family visits may be grieving a home they never truly had. And the person who says, "I'm just tired," may be saying everything. Because exhaustion is often grief wearing work clothes. Hidden grief also affects identity in quiet but powerful ways. It can make you doubt your own preferences. It can make rest feel undeserved. It can make affection feel suspicious when you are not useful first. It can make compliments bounce off because they arrive too late to rewrite history. It can make you crave closeness and fear it at the exact same time. That inner contradiction confuses people. But it makes perfect sense when sadness learned to hide inside attachment. If love once came with unpredictability, then comfort can feel emotionally dangerous. If being noticed once led to criticism, then visibility can trigger grief, not confidence. If your needs were inconvenient, then having needs now can still feel shameful. So yes, sometimes you feel sad and cannot locate the source immediately, because the source is layered. Present sadness often sits on older sadness, like new snow over buried ground. From far away, everything looks clean and quiet. Step on it, and the depth surprises you. This is why healing hidden grief is not about forcing positive thoughts over it. It is about becoming accurate. Accurate about what hurt. Accurate about what was missing. Accurate about how much energy it took to survive without calling it survival. That kind of honesty is gentle, but it is not soft in a weak sense. It takes strength to stop dismissing your own internal reality. It takes maturity to admit some pain stayed because it was never witnessed properly. And witnessing yourself is often the beginning of grief becoming less mysterious, not smaller overnight, just less shapeless, less haunting, less likely to convince you that you are broken for feeling it, because you are not broken. You may be carrying unrecognized sorrow through a life that rewards composure. You may be functioning beautifully while privately mourning things nobody ever asked about. You may be grieving versions of safety, tenderness, innocence, or belonging that never fully arrived. That grief deserves language, even if it never got a ceremony. It deserves patience, even if other people would not understand it immediately. It deserves space, even if your life looks objectively fine from the outside. And maybe that is the most painful part. When your life appears stable, your sadness can start feeling illegitimate. But hidden grief does not need public proof to be real. It only needs truth. So the next time sadness moves through you without a clear headline, pause differently. Do not immediately rush to fix it. Do not insult it with comparison. Do not demand the perfect explanation before offering yourself compassion. Just get curious. Ask what this feeling might remember. Ask what part of you is tired of being translated into acceptable language. Ask what loss was never dramatic enough to earn your attention. Because sometimes the question is not, why am I sad for no reason? Sometimes the real question is, what have I been carrying so long it feels like personality? And once you see that, your sadness stops being a personal failure. It becomes a message. A quiet, intelligent, deeply human message from the parts of you still waiting to be met. Not fixed. Not rushed. Met. And maybe that is where healing begins, not in certainty, but in recognition. In finally admitting that some grief stayed hidden because you had to keep living. In understanding that your unexplained sadness may have been meaningful all along. And in realizing the ache you could never explain was never empty. It was telling the truth before you had words for it.